if they love you, then you have to question the entire worldview.
I think there seems to be a growing disconnect between our legal uses of the words. Those words are taking on a different sort of thing in the culture. It's saying the same thing, they're not meaning the same thing, but people treat it like you do mean the same thing.
I just kept going, further and further and further and further and further. When I came out of it, it was like, oh, I went so far. Like, I believed so many things that I never would have believed.
It seems like there are examples that prove Freud, right? From there, the Pride movement's inevitable.
Welcome back to Down the Rabbit Hole. I'm Mary Horlander. This is probably our most controversial episode, potentially, that will ever take place. And as such, we have a special format today. A guest, my very special friend, Isaiah Blickenstaff. Welcome to the Rabbit Hole.
Yeah, I'm glad to dive down, It's going to be fun.
Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come.
Really great. June is upon us, and as such, we need to talk about all of the cultural implications that go along with it. And I thought, why not bring someone to help make this more of a discussion rather than a rant? So,
Two rants.
Isaiah is a philosopher extraordinaire. He's going to do his master's and is planning on getting a doctorate and has interesting life experience. So I thought he'd have a lot to bring to the table. So here we go.
She's not wrong. But
Hello, darkness, my.
We can have fun.
Good grief. So, as people know, June is known now commonly as Pride Month. And I remember a couple years ago is when it kind of became a bigger movement for people to talk about Sacred Heart Month for the Catholics out there, also being June. And so people were like, oh my gosh, they're trying to take, Pride Month away from us. But as you know, I looked into this, and Pride Month, so the Stonewall riots were in the 60s. Pride Month, I believe, became like an accepted celebration, if you will, in the 90s. And the Sacred Heart Month goes all the way back to 1856 with Pius IX. So we're already starting off really well in terms of truth.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, any thoughts?
Yeah, any thoughts? Whoa. No, it is interesting that there are so many different movements within culture in that time, because think about it, to have the most recognizable thing about June being the Sacred Heart thing for Catholics and Christians generally, I imagine. Moving from the more obvious interpretation being, oh, this is Pride Month.
Yeah.
It's just a different sort of thing. I don't know, and I think it appeals to different groups too.
Yeah.
I would imagine that the older generations, and I don't know this for sure, but I just imagine older generations that are more religious and that like Catholic older Catholics would still be not really know much about Pride Month. And know way more about the Sacred Heart thing.
Yeah.
So that'd be my thought.
You can be ingrained in Pride Month and still not know much about Pride Month because it keeps changing constantly.
Yeah.
And I do think it's interesting because you could argue that the Pride movement is it's sort of a movement against love. And the way I look at it is it's affirmation, but affirmation isn't love. And the Sacred Heart, that's the purest love that has been and ever will be. So it's interesting that they're, coinciding with each other. I think it's very telling in some way. So I guess for those who don't know, so you do philosophy. The reason that I'm talking about this is because I myself got, as you know, sucked into this sort of worldview. It's so convincing and so sort of mind-boggling that anymore I don't even know if I ever truly fit the category to identify as queer, because I definitely don't believe I am nowadays. So it's hard to know, almost like, was I ever bi or whatever it was, or was it just that they confused me so drastically about the definition what love is, because it was like any strong connection that I had must be sexual or romantic in nature. And so that's very, very interesting. And I think a lot of people who talk about this topic either they're very far on one side, and there's a lot of cherry picking, or it can easily be claimed that people are cherry picking examples to make their own point. So I thought it'd be important to talk about what we've actually seen, or different truths that we recognize in that, to kind of actually break it down in sort of an empathetic way, but also, a truthful way.
Yeah.
Because it's like not all Pride celebrations are made equal either. So I think that's really important to note. Have you ever been to a Pride event?
Yes, I have actually.
Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so back in ye old high school days.
Woo!
This is medieval times!
We had, well, I guess it depends on what you mean.
Yeah.
If you mean more of a formal organization of mobilization of a protest or a march or something like that, yes, I have.
Mm-hmm.
I went to Minneapolis with
Minneapolis.
with a couple buddies, and we just got to kind of just watch it. We didn't really participate in it per se.
Mm-hmm.
But we found it interesting.
Yeah.
And it wasn't it wasn't really anything much. I mean, I think of the March for Life in the Catholic world, or the Christian Catholic conservative world, right? It's a very it's a thing where they generally just go and show support and solidarity together, and it seems like the portion of the parade I attended was a lot like that. It was just, there wasn't a lot of I think sometimes I see a lot of stories of these huge things that are going on, people down, taking off their shirts and all this stuff, right? And I bet there's that. I don't doubt it. Obviously, they're getting it for something, but the one I went to was just people together, just holding up signs and just having a good time. It was solidarity.
Do you think that that's because it was a product of another time, which is funny to say because it wasn't that many years ago, but I think we have seen the movement shift pretty drastically even just in the past 10 years.
Yeah, that seems accurate. I don't know. I haven't been to one of those things, so couldn't tell you. But I will say, I wouldn't, if all of a sudden I went to the same sort of event and I just see it off the rails of some sort, I wouldn't be too shocked.
Yeah.
Because I think in general, no matter what, I mean, kind of I wouldn't, same with the pro-life thing though, too, right? If there were people who are holding up more radical signs and stuff, I wouldn't be shocked.
Yeah.
The climate is just so much more ramped up
intense in a sense. Yeah.
So with the Biden presidency and the Trump presidency and just everyone getting really crazy with that, so I wouldn't be shocked. But also it does seem like the Pride movements, the stories you do see are the more
sensational,
grandiose, sensational. So I wouldn't. So it could just be that too. I don't know. But so that was one. The other one would be a school sponsored event.
Okay.
Where they just had Pride Day, where we learned about different things in civics in our history classes about the movement.
Historical things, not.
Yeah, but there was still some promotion of it.
Okay.
It wasn't explicit. It wasn't except these
you should be gay.
Yeah. It wasn't to be fair, I'm not. I would hope that the high schools are still like that. I don't anticipate high school being I just picture a teacher going be gay or something. I feel
I was gay once for a while. No big deal.
I feel that's just not good nor PC, right? But I could see even then it was more it was framed in a particular way, and I do agree with the framing, to be frank about it. It's there's these people who were not treated well for so long.
True.
And here's what happened, because this happened a few years after this happened a few years after Obama's.
Was this around the time of Orlando?
A little before that.
A little before.
A little after that. I mean, but that was referenced quite a bit.
Yeah.
Right. And so they're talking about it was more the LGBTQ stuff was lumped in with the other civic stuff. That happened,
a picture of the 60s or
this is what happened. This is the things. These are some terrible things that happen. These are the ongoing segregation and violence that occur.
Sure.
Right. Like how you talk about African American culture and how that had a lot of hard things. So it's treated as a cultural subset more than anything. And then, and then we just talked about it and engaged with it, and they had the flag. But that was.
Sorry, I'm so sorry. This is the.
It's true. Just the.
Yeah.
Somewhere over the rainbow, there's another rainbow.
Well, did they have the flag?
The flag.
Was it just the? Was it just the 6 stripes at the time?
Yep.
Okay, so they didn't have the whole triangle thing going on.
I don't think so.
Yeah.
I could be misremembering.
Yeah, the triangle, you know what I'm talking about with the blue and the, I think is very much for transgenderism, and I'm sure other things as well, but I think that's kind of the big thing that's come up. I also have been to Pride events. The biggest one I went to was definitely also in Minneapolis, coincidentally enough, probably about, 5 years after you were there. And some of it's innocent enough. They have all the booths and their candles to buy and all this stuff. And one thing that's very striking is there are people who will be there who are offering free sister hugs or free dad hugs. And I think that really speaks to the fact that so many of these people feel so ostracized, and they just want to feel wanted and they want to feel loved, which is really tragic because there's a lot of trauma all the time with a lot of people who identify as queer. And so that, that's why these people go out there. And there are even people who volunteer online. They're like, if your dad's not coming to your wedding, like, I'll be your fill-in dad. And so there's clearly a lot of pain present that I think is part of the fuel for the movement, for sure. And that's hard to see and to think about because, it's like whether you agree with the lifestyle or not, nobody deserves to be treated horribly. Yeah. And there's no doubt that in the past they've been treated horribly, and indeed in certain countries they're treated very horribly. But I think it could be argued nowadays that they're one of the more elevated and protected classes in our society as a general rule, because people are always going to disagree with you. But I mean, even when it just comes to diversity hiring and that sort of thing, being queer is it counts now, which I think is very interesting as well.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot there, right? Because I think one of the interesting, so Mary mentioned I did philosophy. So a lot of times what we do in the philosophy departments is we go through and examine different ways that words are, not every philosopher does this, but if you're in analytic philosophy, you look at words and you try to understand their meanings and how they fit into what's going on right now. Mm-hmm. Right? Continental does it too, but like it depends on what you do. One second.
Nice.
But it depends on what you do. But overall, one thing that a lot of philosophers, especially ethicists, which is more the subset I study, what we do is we really look at like the word law and what that really means, because there's been a lot of different ways it's been taken and stuff, because talk about how different things are encompassed in the words now, right? And that's been reflected in our laws, right? So with governmental political policy and all that, you have different interpretations of the word because you want it to mean something that you can grant freedoms for and defend in court. Yeah. Whereas, like, I think there's at least some. I don't know enough about it to say much, and this whole discussion, like, not like an expert in a lot of it, right? Like, just my read of it is generally, I think there seems to be a growing disconnect between our legal uses of the words and the rights for certain individuals that are in the LGBTQ plus movement. Yeah. Whereas, like, those words are taking on a different sort of thing in the culture. At least in attitude. Like, I don't know. Like
sex, gender.
Yeah, like, I mean, we like the government and sex and gender, like, it wouldn't entirely shock me if there's, like, a lot of new legislation we see that's targeting those words, trying to iron out their legal definitions.
That just happened in the UK.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't be shocked if we see that here.
Yeah.
And not that we haven't, right? But like, just
more concretely,
just more concretely. So I'm more like, snappy for the news articles.
Yeah. Flash.
But anyways, I just with the queer and all the different words you can use within that whole movement, it's really hard to talk about anything in it because everyone means something slightly different by it.
Right. Because we were just talking the other day about what cis meant.
Yeah.
If you're cisgendered, which is, it's such a funny concept to an extent. And I think part of the problem for the movement and for the people who are trying to also understand and in some cases combat the movement is nobody knows what anything means, even inside the movement. They do and they don't, because I think there's disagreement between, for example, is a trans woman the same as a woman or just another type of woman? So is this even under the category of woman, or is it a totally different category, but they still get the same rights that a woman would in the same way as a woman would? So cisgendered is that way as well, because you know, it's like cis man would just mean, you know, assigned male at birth, which is just sex male, but then you also don't try and present as something other than male. And then you have non-binary, which is like anyone can be non-binary, and non-binary can mean a couple of things. It can mean I'm in the middle. It can mean I don't identify as anything. It can be all-encompassing. So it's just very kind of wishy-washy, and even queer. Like, well, what does queer mean? You know, and so many things go under queer. Even there's this term demisexual, which is just attraction. You need emotional closeness before you feel attraction. And then it's funny, and I used to think that was me in an identity way, and then I learned that's just how women are. Yeah. And so it's like everything has to be queerified.
Yeah, and in that too, like if you use the word wrong, that can have
you're hateful.
Yeah, it can have serious consequences socially.
Yeah.
Which is interesting. I mean, that's not a unique thing to the movement per se, because like if you use different words, because words are really their definition seems to come from use. The way we use the word seems to imprint some sort of way that the word means, right? Like if I say duck in a basketball context, and I'm like, oh, where's the duck? And then like the basketball comes and hits me or something like that. like oops, but like. Duck means something different in the context of basketball, the way I use the term there, than it does in something like...
At a pond.
Like at a pond.
Yeah.
And I hope that duck isn't used too often in basketball, because I would find it like, whoa.
Duck! Yeah.
But, so duck. No,
yeah.
But that kind of shows like how our use of the word means things. And the issue, I think, with a lot of this is like, we've kind of weaponized that.
Yeah.
Where it's like, if I use the word in more of a scientific sense, for example, sex and gender, those terms are now radically disagreed upon on what they mean and how they work and how they function, if there is such a distinction. Right? Some people just fold gender as just sex, and some people do it the opposite, which is the words are just becoming really hard to use, because a lot of times, you know, the science field tends to still use sex. But like in the normal culture, that context doesn't really work well.
Yeah.
Because then a lot of times you're like, oh, I'm going to distinguish sex as something biological, and then sometimes that's not the conception. So. Which
is funny, because if you came across, for example, a transgender woman, and you're like, oh, so you're willing to go, yeah, but you're a male, I think they would find issue with that. Yeah. So even though they might say, well, sex and gender are different, I think if you talk that way, I think there's still issue there a lot of the time.
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the person in my mind.
Right, it does.
There could be that, but like...
There are always outliers, but I think the heartbeat of the movement, what is generally pushed and seen in the media, for example, I think is that they would take issue with that.
Yeah, no, that seems right.
Yeah. And I think, and I think also going off of the language is this idea of affirmation versus love, and I think it's so interesting because... If you look at your parents, for example, hopefully you have a loving parent. Every child should have a loving parent, and because your parents love you, and it's not your parents love you but they punish you. Yet it's your parents love you and they punish you, because if you're doing something that's going to lead to, I don't know, one day you're going to end up in prison, or it's just not good for you, it's not healthy. They impose consequences, and that's what teaches you sort of the moral framework to live by, and it teaches you how to treat others and even how to treat yourself and how to apply yourself. And so your parents don't affirm the fact that you hit your brother. They love you, and that's why they say you cannot do that. And so I think there's such a confusion between affirmation and love.
And that's exactly why I think we need to understand kind of like what's happened with the way things are going, because like, right, we've talked about love, affirmation, all this stuff. Some people, like, very few people agree on what words mean all the time. And deep things even less so. Right? Yeah. Like, we're perspectival as humans. We have different perspectives, we bring those, and they form who we are and how we operate in the world.
Yeah.
And one of those huge things is love, right? Like, we have a totally different conception of what love even really means.
Especially in the English language.
Yeah, because, like, you know, the Greek, they had agape, they had Eros, I forget some of them.
Philia?
There's Philia.
And Storge?
Is it Storge or Storge?
I think Storge.
Storge. Whatever.
It's been a hot minute since I've been in school.
Yeah, it's like, I don't specialize in Greek. That's my...
Yeah.
That's my...
Yeah.
But that was a different framework.
Yeah.
And so with love, sexuality,
Yeah.
and gender, like all of these things had different sorts of meanings, and so in general, like if we're looking at sexual ethics now, I think we see a lot of emotive discourse.
Yeah.
We see a lot of times where the meaning of moral statements is merely just
It's emotions.
I approve that, I like that,
Yeah.
and I want you to like it with me.
Right.
Or I dislike that, I don't like it, I want you to dislike that with me, right?
Right.
But how did we get to the state where we lost that meaning? I think you have to look back at history a bit.
Sure.
Because especially in Western culture, there was this idea, this shared concept of really Christianity, but at the very least like this very traditionalist thing, right? Like there was so back in the Middle Ages, for example, there were two thinkers that came quite different, distinct times, but Augustine and Aquinas, and they sketched out a large majority of how the base of Western culture tended to be. Right, which is different than the East. That's worth the distinction because we're really focused on what's going on in the Western.
West, yeah.
But in Western culture, it was really captured by this Christian idea, right? Like that tended to be the big cultural shift, and baked into those systems were notions of what we call teleology, which is a natural end.
Yeah.
So there's something like a nature that people have, and it's directed towards being a certain way, like. Take a toaster, for example.
Yeah.
The telos of the toaster is to toast. Like, it's good insofar as it fulfills that natural end of the toaster. Like if the artifact of the toaster, like if it picks up it toasts some bread and pops them out, like, oh, that's a good toaster because it has a nature of toasting and it's fulfilled that. But if you put it in and all of a sudden, I don't know, it spits up pancakes. Like you put it in and the pancake goes woo. Like,
It'd be kind of nice, but
you're like,
it's not a good toaster.
It's not a good toaster because it doesn't fulfill the natural end.
He likes bread and butter, or he likes toast and jam. That's what his baby feeds him.
It's not a good toaster because it doesn't fulfill the natural end. And Aquinas said that whole builds law, that all builds a law in the cosmos, and that law is natural because it's the natural end of things, and it's really rooted in following Augustine, God, because Augustine said we are made in the image and likeness of God, right, which is recapitulated from Genesis, right, like this is in the Bible, and then Augustine took it, he's like, yes, and imago Dei, like this, we are the image of God, we are image bearers.
Which then makes sense because nowadays, as we've seen such a shift away from any religion, really, and therefore belief in any sort of life after death, because so many religions have that in some capacity, life becomes all about instant gratification and pleasure now in the world.
Yeah, well, but the interesting thing is to figure out why that is, because like humans didn't just suddenly like pleasurable things. Like that's not a new development. Like back in Victorian England, there were still people who were like, I want it all. Like, I don't know. Like you know, that's not new to the human person. So there had to be something different that happened, and this whole system. You're right. It works with a God, and that helps with another belief, which is that there are natures that we have.
Yeah.
Right. Because if we're made in the image of God, you follow the Genesis story, and the Genesis story says He made them man and woman. Right?
Yeah.
So it's a binary conception.
Yeah.
There's a male. There's the male sex, female sex, and the normativity. Normativity, when we talk about in philosopher speak, is like a rule or standard. It's like what you ought to do. If you feel an ought.
Like there are intersex people, but that's generally not. Yeah.
Yeah. It's distinguished from a description, which is like descriptively, if I'm running and I break my ankle, like. Descriptively, I broke my ankle's not working, but that's not how it ought to be. Right? The normativity is that it shouldn't be broken.
Or if you're infertile, you're still a woman,
but the normativity.
You're sick. Yeah.
So that's the notion of normativity. And back then, you appealed to natural law for your normativity. You're like, well, why is that how it ought to be? Why should I a male and female only come together, not a male and male? It's because there's no normative force there, because the normative force is the natural law, which says male female, no male male, no female female for romantic relationships.
I think it comes down to an extent, we have such huge scientific advancements that humans generally like to play God now. We see it, I mean, we give people hormones, we do all these surgeries to change bodies, we have in vitro fertilization. There's so many ways in which things that generally were misunderstood and miraculous even to people. And, how are male and female different? Like, the fact that there are different male and female is just a wonder of nature, if you think about it.
Yeah.
And yet now we see people playing God and trying to take control over all of that.
Yeah, no, and I think that's right. And actually, funnily enough, the guy I study primarily, Heidegger, stipulation, terrible dude. Just like, I always have to say this whenever I bring his name up.
Right.
Awful human being.
Awful human being.
But he was a brilliant thinker, and the issue is trying to untangle that, which is kind of the fun, the Heidegger.
Which is another hot button issue
it's a whole
for a whole other time.
Yeah, but he knows the same thing. Like, we have just power, and it ultimately comes down to a guy named Nietzsche. Nietzsche, you might have heard the phrase "God is dead," or maybe if you're of the more evangelical Christian sort, "God's not dead." The film franchise was born out of this misinterpretation of his quote. But he gave a cultural diagnosis. He said, "God is dead." Why did he say this? Because we had a couple different things, but fundamentally we had a scientific revolution with the Enlightenment and reason and empirical science became this big thing. And we had the Protestant Reformation, where we had a breakdown of what we thought was once unified authority that was always shared, fractured, because we had the Catholic Church, which is like the only church. So if you're Christian, you're Catholic, and you're like, okay, well, you follow this church. After the Protestant Reformation, that's not your authority. The Bible's your authority, or the Bible plus this, or this preacher was the authority, or yada yada.
There's a lot of confusion about
have that, and then the science are like, oh, okay, well, we can finally get away from that religious
science
confusion.
is the one thing we can all agree on.
It's the one thing we can all agree on, so we all come together. And he said, issue that Nietzsche noticed that no one else did, which was like, oh, but if we've killed God, if God, the notion of God is just not intellectually sound anymore, we just rejected it as a culture, whatever it may be, we have now become without a divine teleology. We don't have this natural end. We don't have moral values.
Where do we derive them from?
We derive them, he says, ultimately from ourselves and our desire for power. So we have this notion in Foucault that actually paves the way for two pivotal people that we'll talk about, hopefully, at least in my mind, the Freud and Foucault. But like, overall, it's just this notion of will to power. I, as a human, want and desire power. And in that, if there's no other natural teleology, what I ought to do is follow that. And so power looks different, and you can have and that was fundamentalistic. But so you get a conception of power that's the only really normative force, because normativity really is just a pragmatic thing, is ultimately what we get after Nietzsche.
I think that makes a lot of sense, because as I reflect back on my own experience, it really is kind of like a cult or a religion, in the sense that, for example, any sort of your own reasoning or logic that you bring, like pre-movement, if you will, like pre-awakening, you have to unlearn. That's the big word, is unlearn. And, we use another context as well. Just like trauma, I think, is a very overused word, even though it's real, but like trauma and unlearn and all these things go together. But I had a friend at the time who showed me a video of a man who literally identified as a wolf. And he's, by a river on a bridge, and he's howling. And even though I'm trying to be a part of this movement at the time, this community, I'm like, oh, I'm queer. I looked at this and I went, that's a little strange. Like, I think he's just wrong. That's kind of funny. And I'm being told, no, that's just how people identify. And so I felt very broken down over the years, because I just felt like I was so stupid constantly, because it was like anything in culture that I should know, anything about a certain, identity that I should know, it becomes, it's like these theological truths. And if you disagree, you have to immediately unlearn and learn that stuff, or you're ignorant and potentially hateful. And I think also with that, it's this idea that you're your own God. Because as you're talking about, no longer having a God, or even just this moral order that we all agree on, whether we have the same religion or what, but no longer really kind of relying on science and ourselves. And a lot of this movement is built on my truth. It makes you the center of your own universe. And so it's, for me, when I look back on it, it was very much you worship yourself and you help other people to worship themselves. So if you tell me you're a cat, yes, you are a cat. That's so good. Like, embrace the fact you're a cat, because we're all supposed to be our own God in this movement.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, because if there's no unifying truth of the matter, and importantly, philosophers and scientists alike have kind of come to some sort of consensus on this, that science is really pragmatic, or it's a useful thing, but it's not like a truth-finding thing.
Yeah.
It's useful to get us results we want. Fine, but like, just because science says it doesn't mean it either gets to everything we want it to get to, right? Like,
it's the reason it's called theories.
Yeah.
Even when it's basically proven.
Yeah. Because it's like, even if we can say things, for example, in neuroscience, we can map out lots of different emotions.
Yeah.
But it's rare that you find, though they do exist, but they're very rare that you find people who study that, philosophy of mind or neuroscience or whatever, that would say all of our mental lives are reducible to our brain. Like, that's very rare to find, because there's so much that just isn't explained by it. So, then that leads to other debates, like of whether there's soul and all that stuff. But like, the thing that matters is, like, science, we realize, is useful, but it like can't get us everything we want. It can't give us a fully complete system to find truth. So if there is any truth, it's not fully found in science. Yeah. And
you would say that scientists generally agree with this?
Yeah.
And there are two different schools of thought, is that for some people it goes back to some divine being, and for some people it's found in yourself.
Yeah, because there's nothing else to base it in. You're just like, well, it's useful, but like,
it's your interpretation of it.
Yeah, because I mean, there's a guy named Richard Rorty who's really puts it really well. He says he's a neo-pragmatist, and he says ultimately, truth with a capital T does not exist. It couldn't in principle, because there's no unifying nature of things. Before everything, we had objectivity and then solidarity. He's like, that was the conception. So we have this real way the world is independent of us. Yeah. And then based around those truths, we form communities. And he said, that's the conception we have, and sometimes that's how we operated, but really that was never going to work, because that's not even how it goes. Richard Rorty said, actually, the way it goes is opposite. There's solidarity, there's communities that are together, and to live together, they eventually create some sort of shared objective features that are contingent on their group. So like, their objective features are actually different than the other people's objective features, but they call them objective. And then they encode them in the way that they live, and then that form, and then you get objectivity. So you get solidarity, groups coming together, people coming together, and that makes objectivity.
Very much what's happening with the queer movement.
Yeah, and the issue with that is the objectivity that we have isn't really objective. Yeah, because it there isn't a base, but then it becomes so distant that people are like, well, it is objective.
There's a new base.
There's a new base. It's like, it is objective. And he thinks that's applied to everything. Like, whatever conception. But
I think we see
especially
it very much. And I definitely experienced that, because you start off with, okay, maybe, I'm going along with different types of attraction, and I'm going along with gay marriage. And then before you know it, people are wolves. And it was like, every time I would make a concession, and I would live in this sort of, okay, these are the queer beliefs that I'm a part of. And then there would be something else that would happen, like Leah Thomas in the college swimmers, and that opens up a whole debate about trans athletes. And as a very competitive person myself, who was an athlete growing up, I thought, well, that's not very fair. But then over time, they break you down. They're like, well, that's hateful. Oh, my bad. And so you just keep following what the community guidelines are, if you will.
Yeah. And there's no other base for those community guidelines other than that community. Yeah. And
so you just fall deeper and deeper without meaning to.
And with the will to power, each group is going to be competing with each other. The issue that I'm not particularly, so sexual ethics isn't really my huge, like the thing I'm most focused on, but it's present here too. But in general in ethics, we find a really hard time with the problem of incommensurability. It seems like it's really hard to start conversations, because we have just so different of objective values. Yeah. Because the issue is, Richard Rorty seems to be onto something, which is that it seems like each group is operating under these different sort of objective notions, and they mean something different in their groups, right? The way they use the terms are different. The standards, the laws, the community guidelines are different.
Yeah.
And so when you come in conflict, you're like think pro-life, pro-choice. Like, pro-lifers will go up and talk to pro-choice advocates and be like, how in the world could you kill a baby? But the pro-choice people will say, that was never a baby to begin with.
Yeah.
Like, that's not a thing. So
you can't argue over something effectively if you don't even know what you're arguing over.
Exactly, because they're completely using the words differently.
Yeah.
They don't mean the same thing.
Yeah.
So in saying the same thing, they're not meaning the same thing, but people treat it like you do mean the same thing.
Yeah.
And then it butts heads. And in the LGBTQ plus movement debates on sexual ethics and stuff,
what is a woman? What is a man? What is love?
You don't have any of that, and you have just a bunch of objective
emotions
that you've encoded and are now just getting bombarded with. And if you're somebody who hasn't really thought about it or entered these debates, you kind of get swept up in one or the other, and then that you get sucked into a power vacuum. For me,
I'm a very empathetic person, and I'm very sensitive, and so I just wanted to understand other people, and it can get very, very confusing, because especially if you ever talk about the feminine genius, and I'm sure men of course as well, we just want so much to take care of people and to love people, and be generous with ourselves and our hearts with other people, and to do that, you're listening to other people's experiences, and then in a world where words can mean everything and nothing at the same time, it's so easy to get confused and just go, well, but this is what love is. I just want to be caring. And, I never meant, I grew up in a very conservative family, a very Catholic family. And before you know it, I just kept going, further and further and further and further and further. And, you just wake up one day and you're like, oh my gosh, when I came out of it, it was like, oh, I went so far. Like, I believed so many things that I never would have believed. I saw so many things that I never would have in a million years, if you 16-year-old Mary would be disgusted. And I witnessed these things, and it was normalized.
Yeah, no, and actually I think that reaction actually is really interesting from a lot of different ways, because with that being the case, right? You had this conservative family, and you reacted against it.
Yeah.
But why would you react against it?
Well, I think there's a lot of things, but I think that. The Pride movement really depends upon this idea that you are alienated. Mm-hmm. And so I believed that I was queer. I don't anymore, but I believed I was queer and healing. And I was told, conservative Catholic people hate queer people. Mm-hmm. And so forever, for years, I was just mortified of my family finding out, even of friends finding out, because they're going to hate me, they're going to ostracize me, I'm never going to see them again, all these things. And yet every single time I was proven wrong. Every single time it was like, well, I love you. And so then I'm floundering to come up with a reason as to why, well, but they still don't understand me and they're still this. Because if they love you, then you have to question the entire worldview.
Yeah. And so with that, I think that shows something that Freud found, which is funny. The thing that he found, and I'm sorry that happened in general, because that there's just so much confusion, right? Like, just the fact of whiplash, right? Like, there's this whole thing, but so this whole thing of power, right? If that really is the only talking point we have, and people tried to fight against Nietzsche on this, like there was a couple movements, and there's a lot of history there, but ultimately it ends up being that people started taking seriously, like, okay, Nietzsche was probably right. There is this power, will to power that's being exercised in a lot of things. And Freud noticed something that he called, well, I mean, a lot of people noticed it, but like Freud with it called it repressive power.
Yeah.
Which is like a sort of abuse of power. And so he realized that in every civilization that he looked at seemed like it had conceptions of different conceptions of how sexuality and sexual ethics looks. Mm-hmm. And he thought that in each and every case they seemed to be wrong, especially like the Victorian era, right? think of like women having to wear corsets and like this very stringent like you talked with another man, you know, like
how dare you?
How dare you? Like all these things.
Yeah.
But the way he looked at it, he's like, wait, so these moral conceptions that don't have any grounding anymore, right? Like there's no common base. The only base is power. It seems then that power is being used to tell people how they should be. And he called that repressive power.
I think you could tie that kind of to cancel culture.
Yeah, which is the interesting thing about the Freudian analysis is like all of this is kind of spilled out in the culture. But he at first realized, he's like, okay, with all this, sexual health and liberation needs to be achieved, because he thought that we just our goal is self-actualization. And if our goal is self-actualization, we shouldn't be subjugated by the powers that be. So for him, he thought that when, for example, like a church structure tells you this is what you ought not to do, this is what you should do as this sort of person. He said, by labeling me this sort of person, you are boxing me in, and then by saying this is what I ought to do and what I ought not to do, you are not letting me be me. And in not letting me be me, I am living less mentally well.
And
so my mental health is going to be in the gutter.
That's the pride movement.
And that's not going to be good. And so what I need to do is take pride in who I am. I need to overcome this repressive act.
Yeah.
And
embrace every whim I have, because that's me.
Yeah, exactly. And so the interesting thing that this spills out into is partially rooted in truth. I mean, think of Victorian England. Like the moral system there was a bunch of emotivism. It was people saying, ooh, this is new, I don't like that.
Sure.
And so it's wrong.
Yeah.
Right? And so there was a lot of that back in the day, and probably still, right? And I should say, and still. And there is, and, you know, a lot of times, and this is no matter what culture, no matter where you're at, people are really bad at listening. Like, people are really bad at acknowledging, like, that's how I feel, let me hear you out. A lot of times we do have emotive reaction. So people will say, like if you came out as queer to somebody in a religious culture, it wouldn't be entirely shocking for them to be like, you know, like, so especially
at least that's what we're told.
That's and
it definitely does happen.
And definitely that's happened. And so like I think that it's important to recognize that things like that have happened. Yeah. I mean, think about the violence that's occurred with that. Think about just in general. Like, so it seems like there are examples that prove Freud, right? Or at least vindicate his account enough to buy into it. Sure. And then from there, the pride movement's inevitable. Because how could it not be? Because, like I said, there's not been... It's not like hedonism. It's not like the desire for pleasures of any sort, regardless, is new. Yeah. But it's or for love. But it's in a different sort of state than it once was. Because, like, right now, we have realized truths about structural powers and how abusive they can be. But we've also noticed, too, like, that that can be flipped, too. Like in the LGBTQ plus movement sometimes. We sometimes see that where people are ostracized for not believing in certain conceptions that an individual holds. Yeah, because if you identify as, you know, gay or lesbian, for example, and you don't buy into maybe transgender surgeries for children, you know, now you're against the grain. Are you going to be accepted at a pride event? Yeah, and it's really, again, that's the solidarity and objectivity thing. Like, the group used to be like a huge encompassing thing, and now it's getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and lots of little groups that form. But it's also getting bigger. Yeah, it's like I don't know, like some big structure is now a lot of little pieces that have kind of been spreading out and growing. It's kind of like a spider web. Yeah. There you go. It's like a spider web. It's like a spider web. Yeah. You get caught in it. Yeah.